It happened so fast that no one was sure they saw it correctly. A blur of motion, a gasp, a silence so sharp it cut through the hum of the first-class cabin. One moment the aisle was calm. The next, the sound of a slap cracked the air like a whip. A woman mid-40s, sharply dressed, her face flushed with entitlement, had raised her hand against a child. Not just any child, but one of three identical young black boys sitting neatly side by side, their small feet barely brushing the floor, their travel clothes matching in quiet coordination, navy sweaters, crisp white collars, small gold pins shaped like wings. For heartbeat, time stalled. The boy's cheeks stung red. His brother's froze, their wide eyes reflecting disbelief, confusion, and something deeper, the kind of pain a child shouldn't know. Around them, murmurs rippled, hesitation thick in the air. Passengers looked on, some standing halfway out of their seats, caught between conscience and cowardice. The woman's face twisted with false righteousness, as though her violence was justified. She muttered something under her breath, the kind of venom that hides behind the tone of, "I was just correcting him," the kind of poison that history knows too well. The flight attendant nearest the scene hesitated. Fear flickered in her eyes, not for the child, but for the discomfort of confrontation. That was the moment the silence became its own accomplice. 3 children, 1 blow, a cabin full of witnesses. The mother wasn't there, not yet. The triplets had boarded early, escorted by staff. They were traveling with family approval, part of a reunion flight meant to be joyful. But in that instant, joy was replaced by the cold shadow of humiliation. Somewhere deep in the aircraft, behind the hum of engines and the shuffle of passengers, fate was moving toward this scene, measured, deliberate, unstoppable, because the woman who had just lifted her hand against a child had no idea whose child it was. Outside on the tarmac, a sleek black car pulled to a stop beneath the boarding bridge. The door opened, and a tall, composed black woman stepped out, elegant in her silence, commanding without trying. Her name was Dr. Mariah Langston, the newly appointed CEO of the very airline this plane belonged to. She was coming aboard to make a quiet inspection before takeoff, unaware that her presence was about to rewrite everything that had just unfolded inside. Back in the cabin, one of the boys blinked hard, holding back tears he didn't understand how to name. His brother reached out, their small hands finding each other, instinctive comfort in a world that suddenly felt unsafe. The woman turned away, unbothered. The crew looked on, unwilling to act. But above all of it, the tension, the fear, the stillness, there was something else forming. A reckoning. And when that plane door closed, when the engines began to rumble, and when the CEO stepped on board just minutes later, no one, not even the woman who thought she ruled the cabin, could have guessed that this flight was about to become a mirror that would reflect every hidden prejudice, every silent witness, every system that allowed this moment to happen. Because before this flight landed, everyone on board would be forced to face what they'd just seen, and who they really were when the world stopped watching. Long before that slap, before the gasps and the silence, the day had begun with joy. A family reunion was waiting across the country, cousins, uncles, and grandparents gathering to celebrate something special, the 10th birthday of the Langston triplets. 3 boys who shared the same face but had very different souls, Miles, the quiet observer, Carter, the dreamer, and Jaden, the spark of mischief that made the others laugh when they needed it most. They were the sons of Dr. Mariah Langston, a woman whose presence could fill a boardroom, but whose gentleness at home was disarming. To the public, she was the youngest black woman ever to lead an international airline, the one who broke through ceilings made of glass and prejudice alike. But to her boys, she was just Mom, the one who tucked them in with whispered prayers and packed their favorite comic books for long flights. The morning light poured through the tall windows of their Atlanta home as the boys' laughter echoed down the hall. Their bags were lined up neatly by the door, monogrammed, not for show, but because Mariah believed that order gave children a sense of peace. She moved through the house that morning with the quiet rhythm of someone who'd learned how to hold grace under pressure. Her phone buzzed constantly, Executives asking for approvals, board members seeking reassurance, reporters wanting comments on her upcoming speech about diversity in aviation. But her focus, this morning, wasn't on shareholders or strategy. It was on three boys who were growing faster than she could catch her breath. They were flying ahead of her that afternoon, accompanied by airline staff and trusted attendants. Mariah had meetings that would delay her by an hour or two, but she'd promised to meet them at their destination before dinner. "It's just one flight," she'd said to her assistant. "They'll be fine. It's our airline, our people." That's what she believed. But beneath the polished order of her world, she knew something she didn't say out loud. Being black in spaces that weren't built for you came with rules that didn't have to be spoken. She'd felt it herself, in the way certain smiles tightened when she entered a room, in the subtle surprise when people realized she was the CEO, not the assistant. Success hadn't shielded her from racism. It had simply changed its form. As she watched her sons board that flight, laughing, waving, all innocence and energy, a flicker of unease brushed against her heart. She brushed it off. The flight attendants were friendly, the pilot respectful. The other passengers smiled, at least on the surface. What harm could there be in three well-behaved children sitting quietly in first class? The truth, as it often does, would answer in the cruelest way. The boys had been seated early. Miles sat by the window, his eyes wide as he looked out over the runway. Carter fiddled with the wing-shaped pin a flight attendant had handed him, proud to wear something that matched his mother's world. Jaden hummed under his breath, tapping his sneakers against the footrest in rhythm. They didn't notice the woman right away. She boarded last, her perfume arriving before her voice. She had the kind of presence that filled space without invitation, her eyes scanning the cabin with expectation rather than gratitude. Her name was Evelyn Moore, a woman used to being obeyed and rarely questioned. She carried herself with the assurance of someone who believed money was the measure of worth. When she saw the three boys in first class, her expression tightened. It wasn't overt at first, just a shift in her jaw, a flicker in her eyes. But prejudice rarely announces itself loudly. It lingers in the small ways people look, the tone they take when they think they're being polite. She stood by her seat, frowning. "Are these children supposed to be here?" she asked the nearest flight attendant, her voice low but edged with disdain. The attendant smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "Yes, ma'am, they're unaccompanied minors, but they're authorized to travel." Evelyn cut her off with a tight smile. "In first class," she said, as though the words tasted wrong in her mouth. The attendant hesitated. The boys heard, but stayed still. Miles gripped the armrest, trying to make himself smaller. Carter turned to the window. Jaden's little face scrunched in confusion. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. The air had already shifted. At 30,000 feet, the plane hummed with the quiet lull of cruising altitude. Movies flickered on seatback screens, the scent of reheated food drifted through the aisle, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But Evelyn couldn't let it go. Every small sound, cough, a laugh, the shuffle of their sneakers, irritated her. Her mind built stories that justified her contempt. "They're unsupervised," she thought. "They're disturbing the peace." She ignored the truth that they were perfectly behaved. Because prejudice doesn't see behavior, it sees difference, then looks for reasons to validate hate. Miles noticed her glances. He wasn't old enough to understand racism, but he'd seen that look before. In grocery stores, at playgrounds, the places where people's smiles didn't reach their eyes. His mother always told him to be still, be respectful, and remember who you are. But in that seat, stillness didn't protect him. A dropped toy became a moment of tension. Carter reached down to pick it up, and Evelyn's bag shifted as his elbow brushed the armrest. It was nothing, a movement so small no one else would have noticed. But to her, it became an offense. She turned sharply, her voice cut through the hum of the cabin. "Watch where you're going," she snapped. Heads turned. The boys froze. Carter whispered a quick apology, barely audible. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. The flight attendant approached, trying to smooth things over. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Evelyn smiled tightly, "It's fine," she said, but her tone carried venom. She looked down at Carter again. "Some people just need to learn boundaries." That word, "some people," hung in the air like smoke. The attendant hesitated, her own discomfort visible, but muted. She glanced at the boys, 3 children of color alone in a space that had already judged them, and then stepped back, choosing silence. That was the first betrayal. Back in Atlanta, Mariah was still at the office, reviewing a flight report. Her assistant handed her a folder with a smile. "Your sons should be boarding soon." Mariah nodded absently, her mind half on work, half on them. She glanced at the photo on her desk, the triplets standing in front of her jet during a family day event. Their arms were wrapped around each other, their grins wide and fearless. They looked untouchable. She didn't know, as she smiled at that photo, that her sons were already being reduced to those kids by a stranger who believed she was above them. She didn't know that within an hour, that stranger's arrogance would ignite something far larger than a slap, something that would shake an entire airline and expose how fragile civility becomes when racism hides behind manners. As the flight continued, Evelyn's irritation grew. The boys whispered among themselves, passing a small pack of gum back and forth. To anyone else, it was harmless. To her, it was offense. Her mind twisted their presence into intrusion, her prejudice feeding on the sight of them occupying a space she thought was reserved for people like her. And then, in one brief, devastating second, her control snapped. But that moment belongs to another part of the story. For now, the stage is set. 3 innocent boys in first class, a woman whose prejudice burns beneath politeness, and a mother who, even as she signs executive memos about equality, is about to be tested in a way no policy could prepare her for. Because this flight isn't just a trip. It's a mirror, one the world will soon be forced to look into. The hum of the jet engines should have been soothing, that steady vibration that lulls passengers into comfort. But for Miles, Carter, and Jaden Langston, the air had thickened into something heavy, invisible, and suffocating. Every time Evelyn Moore shifted in her seat, every time she exhaled sharply or muttered under her breath, the boys flinched slightly. Their bodies knew something was wrong, even if their young minds couldn't yet name it. Miles tried to keep his eyes on the clouds outside. They looked soft, almost like the pillows back home in his room, the ones his mother had fluffed for him before bed. He wanted to think about that instead, about the world where people were kind, where adults smiled, where his mother's voice could fix everything. But that world felt far away now, sealed behind a door at 30,000 feet. A flight attendant passed by, tray in hand, offering drinks with the warm professionalism that came from years of training. She smiled at the triplets, but it was the kind of smile that came with hesitation, one that faltered as soon as Evelyn's cold eyes met hers. The woman quickly turned away, pretending not to notice the tension radiating from row 2A. That was the second betrayal, the kind that comes wrapped in silence. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her face composed, but her mind seething. The mere presence of the boys offended her sense of order. They represented something she didn't understand, privilege without her permission, innocence she couldn't control. She saw them as invaders in a space she believed was reserved for her kind, her class, her comfort. Her thoughts curdled with judgment. Their parents probably didn't even pay for those seats. Someone must have upgraded them. Entitlement, plain and simple. But what Evelyn didn't know was that the tickets hadn't just been paid for. The very airline she flew belonged to their mother. The irony was building, silent and patient. Time passed slowly. Passengers adjusted their seatbelts, ordered wine, checked their watches. Life inside the cabin seemed normal, but for the triplets, every moment felt magnified. When the plane hit a patch of mild turbulence, Jaden reached for his brother's hand, his instinctive need for comfort masked behind a nervous laugh. Evelyn's lips curled. "Some children aren't ready for this class of travel," she murmured, just loud enough for the nearby row to hear. A man across the aisle looked up, but quickly buried his face in a newspaper, unwilling to get involved. That was the third betrayal, the look away. The triplets didn't move. They didn't respond. Their mother had always told them, when people treat you unfairly, Let your dignity be louder than your anger. But they were just children, and sometimes dignity can feel like silence. Miles swallowed hard, licking back tears. Carter shifted in his seat, fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. Jaden leaned into his brothers, whispering something no one else could hear. Maybe a joke, maybe a prayer. The flight attendants passed again, offering more drinks. Evelyn's glass of red wine trembled slightly on the tray, a few droplets spilling onto her napkin. She glared down at it, then up, and her gaze landed once again on the three boys. The story she'd built in her head, the one where they were trouble, needed fuel, and prejudice, when left unchecked, always finds it. It started with a sneeze. A simple, innocent sneeze. Jaden's nose tickled from the recycled cabin air. He sneezed softly into his sleeve, barely audible over the hum of the plane. But Evelyn's head snapped toward him, as if he'd shouted. Her face tightened. Her voice, sharp and deliberate, sliced through the air. "Can someone teach these children some manners?" she said. The flight attendant froze. The passengers nearby looked up, some curious, others uncomfortable. Evelyn dabbed at her sleeve with exaggerated disgust, as if invisible germs had violated her space. "This is first class," she added, her voice dripping with venom. "Not daycare." The attendant tried to intervene, offering tissues with a nervous laugh. "Ma'am, it's okay. He's just a little boy." Evelyn's gaze was icy. "I expect cleanliness, respect, control," she said, turning her attention to the triplets. If their parents cared about those things, maybe they'd be here. That sentence hit like a slap in itself, cruel, calculated, and meant to humiliate. Miles looked down. Carter stared blankly at the seat in front of him. Jaden's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't make a sound. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was internalized, soaked deep into the hearts of three innocent children who'd done nothing wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. At the back of the plane, a young attendant named Rosa, the same woman who'd seated the boys earlier, felt her stomach twist. She wanted to speak up, to tell the woman to stop, but fear clawed at her throat. She'd seen how certain passengers could destroy a crew member's career with one complaint. The power dynamic was clear. Evelyn was the kind of customer airlines feared losing. The triplets were children who didn't yet understand their own power. So Rosa stayed quiet. She served drinks. She smiled when she didn't mean to, and she hated herself for it. Back in Atlanta, Mariah Langston's flight had just taken off. She leaned back in her seat, exhausted but satisfied that her morning meetings were done. She thought of her boys, imagining them laughing, watching cartoons on the in-flight screen. Her phone was on airplane mode, her mind finally at peace. She didn't know that in another cabin, thousands of feet above the same clouds, her children were sitting small and silent, their joy drained into shame. As the plane neared cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled in, pulling blankets over their laps. Evelyn reached for her wine again, gesturing sharply when the attendant refilled it. The alcohol only fueled her arrogance. She looked at the boys once more. Three small figures in matching clothes, heads bowed. And then, the moment that would define everything began. A slight bump of turbulence. The wine glass slipped in her hand, tipping sideways. Red liquid splashed across the edge of her tray, streaking the white napkin. In her drunken irritation, she looked up sharply, and in that twisted second of perception, she decided to blame them. Her voice rose, sharp and indignant. "You made me spill my wine." The cabin froze. Every passenger turned. Every whisper stopped. Evelyn stood up abruptly, her face flushed. This is what happens when children who don't belong here are allowed to take seats meant for adults. Miles's chest tightened. Carter froze. Jaden whimpered softly, tears now rolling freely down his cheeks. And then, in a flash of rage, Evelyn did what no one imagined she could. Her hand swung, connecting sharply with Carter's cheek. The sound cracked through the cabin, a sharp, shocking slap that echoed over the hum of the engines. For a second, no one breathed. Time fractured. Even the air seemed to recoil. Carter's head snapped sideways. His little hand went to his face, eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't cry, he couldn't. His body froze, trapped in a child's confusion between fear and shame. Miles lunged forward instinctively, wrapping his arms around his brother. Jaden's voice broke in a sob. The entire cabin was silent, until someone finally spoke. Did she just hit him? The question hung heavy. Passengers began to murmur. The attendants rushed forward, their calm professionalism cracking under the weight of horror. Rosa was the first to reach the row. She looked at Carter's tear-streaked face, then up at Evelyn. "Ma'am," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you just struck a child." Evelyn blinked, her fury twisting into indignation. "Don't you dare accuse me. He was misbehaving, invading my space." Rosa didn't hear the rest. She knelt beside the boys, her hands gentle, her heart pounding. "It's okay," she whispered to them. "You're safe." But her own voice shook, betraying the lie. The captain was alerted. The crew scrambled. The passengers whispered, filmed, and watched, some with outrage, others with cowardly fascination. The power dynamic was unraveling in real time. And through it all, Evelyn stood rigid, her expression oscillating between fury and fear. "I'll have your job," she snapped at Rosa. "And there's two. Whoever let them sit here." The irony was waiting like a thunderclap, unseen but inevitable, because at that very moment, as the flight prepared to make an emergency landing, Mariah Langston's plane, the CEO's plane, was descending toward the same airport. She had no idea yet that she would step off that jet into a storm, one where power, prejudice, and parenthood would collide at 35,000 feet. And when she walked down that jet bridge, calm and composed, the world would finally see who those triplet boys belonged to. The balance of control was about to shift, and it would never shift back. The air was no longer just heavy. It was electric, vibrating with the raw, unspoken knowledge that something irreversible had happened. A white woman had struck a black child in first class. And now, the world inside that cabin had split in two, those who would look away and those who wouldn't. Carter sat frozen, tears gathering but refusing to fall. His small hand still covered his cheek, the faint imprint of Evelyn's palm bright against his dark skin. Miles's arm wrapped protectively around him, his breathing shallow, his heart drumming in panic. Jaden's face was buried in his hands, his quiet sobs muffled against the seat. Rosa, trembling, tried to collect herself. She'd seen rudeness, entitlement, drunken passengers, but never this. Never violence. She swallowed, her training colliding with her humanity. She was supposed to de-escalate, to smile, to protect the airline's image. But how do you de-escalate a wound you can't unsee? "Ma'am," Rosa said quietly, standing up, "please take your seat." Evelyn's voice was sharp enough to cut through steel. "Don't tell me what to do. That child, Rosa said, her voice firmer now, is a passenger, and you just assaulted him." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Phones were out now, the quiet, glass eyes of a dozen cameras blinking in judgment. One man whispered to his wife, "Record everything." Evelyn's face flushed crimson, but she refused to back down. "Oh, please. You're all overreacting. They were disruptive. I barely touched him." Barely. The word hung like poison in the air. Miles turned his head slightly, his voice quiet but steady, the first time he'd spoken since it happened. "You hit my brother." He didn't shout. He didn't cry. But in his small, trembling voice, there was something ancient, something that carried generations of exhaustion. Evelyn opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was drowned by the captain's announcement overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a situation on board, we'll be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and calm as we begin our descent." The cabin gasped. People exchanged looks. A few clapped softly in support of the boys. Others kept silent, eyes low, not wanting to get involved. As the plane began its slow descent, Evelyn's confidence began to crack. She looked around and saw no allies, no sympathetic faces, not even the usual nods of validation she was accustomed to receiving in moments of self-righteousness. Instead, she saw disgust. She saw judgment. She saw truth. Her heart pounded in her chest. Fear, that alien feeling, began to crawl up her spine. She tried to compose herself, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve, but her hand trembled. "You'll all regret judging me," she muttered. "You don't know who I am." But she didn't realize how cruelly that sentence would turn against her in just a few minutes. At the front of the cabin, Rosa whispered to the head attendant, "We have to inform the authorities. She hit a child, a minor." The lead attendant nodded grimly. "And corporate? They'll want to know immediately." Corporate. That word hung like a trigger in the universe, because corporate meant the office that oversaw every flight, every employee, every decision. And at the very top of that chain sat one woman, Mariah Langston, the CEO of Langston Air. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain radioed the ground. "Control, this is Flight 417 requesting emergency landing clearance. Passenger assault on a minor. Repeat, assault on a minor. Law enforcement requested on arrival." Control acknowledged, calm and professional. They didn't know yet who the minor was, but they would. The descent began. The cabin lights brightened slightly. The quiet roar of the engines filled the silence like a heartbeat. Every passenger was aware that they were descending into something much larger than turbulence. They were descending into consequence. Carter sat between his brothers, clutching Miles's sleeve. His small voice trembled. "Are we in trouble?" Miles shook his head quickly. "No, buddy. You didn't do anything wrong." Jaden wiped his face, whispering, "Mom's gonna be mad, right?" Miles looked out the window. Below, the city stretched like veins of gold against the night. He swallowed hard. "Not us," he said. "She'll be mad at her." The wheels touched down. The brakes screamed. Passengers exhaled in relief, but tension still crackled in the air. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Evelyn tried to reclaim control. She smoothed her hair, straightened her jacket, and whispered to herself, "I'll handle this. I'll make one call and this will all go away." She didn't yet understand that her power had already expired, the moment her hand had struck that child. At the gate, uniformed officers waited. The door opened with its familiar hiss, and the lead attendant quickly stepped out, whispering to the ground staff. Evelyn stood up, ready to march past everyone, but Rosa blocked her path. "Please remain seated, ma'am." Evelyn laughed, a brittle, arrogant laugh that sounded almost desperate. "You think you can stop me? Do you even know who I am?" The officer entered the cabin. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "please stay where you are." Her face went pale. "You can't." "I can," the officer interrupted. "You're being detained for questioning regarding the assault of a minor." The words hit her harder than turbulence ever could. "Assault? You have no idea, these children." But before she could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. Slow, deliberate, confident. A woman's silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall, poised, dressed in a black business suit that carried the quiet authority of power. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence filled the cabin like gravity. Mariah Langston had arrived. For a moment, no one moved. The passengers didn't recognize her, but the flight attendants did. Rosa's eyes widened, not in fear, but in awe. Evelyn, however, mistook her for someone ordinary. "Finally," she snapped. "Someone in charge. I've been assaulted by incompetence on this plane, and Mariah's voice cut clean through the noise, calm, low, controlled. "You assaulted my son." The words were simple, but the silence that followed was shattering. Evelyn blinked. "I what?" Mariah stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the cabin floor. Her eyes were sharp, cold fire, the kind of fury that burns quietly, the kind that doesn't need volume to destroy you. "I'm Mariah Langston," she said, "Chief Executive Officer of Langston Air." She glanced down at her boys, Miles, Carter, Jaden, and her voice softened for a fraction of a second. "And these are my children." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. Rosa covered her mouth, tears brimming. Evelyn's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her arrogance, once armor, now crumbled into dust. Mariah knelt in front of Carter, gently touching his cheek. "Baby," she whispered. "Are you okay?" He nodded, his small voice barely audible. "She hit me, Mommy." Mariah closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her expression was calm, but the calm of someone who'd chosen control over chaos. She stood up slowly, turning to the officers. "Please escort this woman off my aircraft." Evelyn tried to stammer an excuse, but her voice betrayed her. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who." Mariah's tone was razor-sharp. "That's the problem. You shouldn't need to know who they are to treat them with respect." Her voice carried across the cabin like a verdict. Passengers nodded. Some even clapped softly, not out of spectacle, but out of moral recognition. Evelyn was escorted out, her protests dissolving into quiet sobs. The cameras followed her, recording every step of her humiliation. For once, her power meant nothing. When the door closed behind her, the cabin fell into a heavy, aching silence. Mariah turned to Rosa, her gaze softening. "Thank you for staying with them." Rosa shook her head. "I should have done more." "You did enough," Mariah said quietly. "You stayed human." The plane emptied slowly. Passengers offered kind words, gentle glances. Some apologized without needing to, as if trying to heal something collective. Others walked in silence, shaken by what they'd witnessed. Mariah held her sons close, one arm around each. Carter's face pressed into her jacket. Miles whispered, "Mom, are you mad?" Mariah took a deep breath. "No, baby. I'm proud of you. You did nothing wrong." "But she hit him," Jaden said, his voice trembling, and no one stopped her. Mariah's eyes glistened. She looked down at her sons, at their innocence, their confusion, their quiet pain. "I know," she said softly. "That's the world sometimes. But that's why we keep fighting to make it better." Outside, news cameras had already gathered. Someone had leaked the footage mid-flight. The world was watching. The headline was already forming. "Woman strikes black child in first class, unaware he's the CEO's son." But Mariah didn't look at the cameras. She just walked past them, her boys in tow, their small hands gripping hers. For her, this wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation, because the slap that echoed across the cabin wasn't just one woman's crime. It was society's mirror, and now that mirror had cracked wide open for everyone to see. The morning after the flight, the world woke up to chaos. Every screen, from smartphones to televisions, lit up with the same image. Evelyn Warren, disheveled and humiliated, being escorted off a Langston Air flight, surrounded by police officers. The headline cut like a blade. "White passenger assaults black child in first class, then learns she struck the CEO's son." The footage had gone viral overnight. Millions watched it. The slap, the gasps, the stunned silence, and finally, the quiet power of Mariah Langston walking down the aisle to face the woman who'd attacked her child. The internet erupted. Hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag justice for the triplets. Hashtag not just a seat. Hashtag Langston Air. Hashtag protect black children. But behind the digital noise, there was still the raw human ache. A family trying to recover from a wound that went deeper than a slap. In her penthouse office overlooking the city, Mariah sat by the window, a cup of untouched coffee in her hand. The morning light reflected off the glass walls, painting everything in gold, but she felt none of its warmth. Her assistant, Jordan, hovered hesitantly by the door. "Ma'am, the board wants to issue a statement. Media's requesting a live comment." Mariah didn't answer right away. She stared at the skyline, her thoughts somewhere far beyond the horizon. "What kind of statement?" she asked finally. Jordan cleared his throat. They want something neutral, acknowledging the incident, expressing regret, but avoiding anything that could be seen as accountability." He nodded, shamefaced. Mariah turned her gaze to him, sharp, steady, but not unkind. "We're not doing that." "Ma'am." She stood, crossing the room to her desk. "Neutrality is what keeps this kind of thing alive. You don't stop a disease by pretending it's a misunderstanding. Jordan lowered his eyes. What do you want to say then? Mariah's voice softened, but it carried a quiet power. The truth. The truth is that a white woman felt entitled to lay hands on a black child because she didn't see him as a child. She saw him as less than her. And that is the rot we keep painting over with politeness. She paused, her jaw tightening. We're done painting. Later that day, she stood in front of a wall of cameras. The Langston Air logo gleamed behind her, but this wasn't corporate. This was personal. She didn't use a teleprompter, didn't read from notes. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every mother who'd ever had to protect her child from a world that questioned their right to exist safely. Yesterday, 3 of our youngest passengers, my sons, were assaulted by another passenger aboard one of our flights. Not because of what they did, but because of what they looked like. And though she didn't know who they were, her actions spoke to something far larger than one moment of violence. The room was silent. Cameras clicked softly, like nervous heartbeats. This isn't about power or revenge, she continued. This is about reflection. It's about asking ourselves why we still live in a world where a child's innocence is filtered through the color of their skin. It's about confronting the quiet racism that hides behind words like disturbance and entitlement. Her eyes flicked briefly to the reporters in front of her, mostly white, mostly uncomfortable. We say we're better than this, but are we? She let the question hang in the air before finishing. Langston Air will be implementing new anti-bias and accountability policies, effective immediately. But more importantly, I hope this moment reminds us all that decency isn't a policy. It's a choice. Every single day. She didn't wait for applause. She simply stepped away from the podium, her composure unshaken, her truth already echoing through millions of screens around the world. Meanwhile, Evelyn Warren sat in her suburban home, blinds drawn, her phone buzzing nonstop. Her social media accounts were gone, deleted overnight. Her employer had suspended her. Reporters camped outside her driveway. The woman who once moved through life with arrogance now sat trembling at her kitchen table, surrounded by headlines calling her the first-class bigot. But what haunted her most wasn't the cameras. It was the memory of that slap, and the eyes of the boys she'd struck. They weren't angry. They were confused. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn understood what shame really felt like. Back at home, Mariah tried to protect her sons from the noise. She'd taken a leave of absence from work, turning off interviews, declining calls, pulling the curtains to block out the paparazzi lenses that peered from the street below. Inside, the house was quiet, but not peaceful. The boys were different now, not broken, but quieter, like something in them had grown up too soon. At dinner, Miles pushed his plate away. "Mom, everyone at school knows," he said softly. Mariah looked at him. "What did they say?" "Some kids said you were a hero," he murmured. "Others said she didn't mean it. That maybe you overreacted." Her heart clenched. "And what do you think?" Miles hesitated. "I think people only understand pain when it's theirs." She reached across the table, touching his hand gently. "You're wiser than most adults I know." Carter glanced up, voice trembling. "Mom, why did she hate us?" Mariah froze. There was no good answer to that question. No logic. No reason that could ever justify hatred wrapped in skin color. "She didn't hate you," Mariah said finally, her voice quiet. "She hated what she's been taught to fear. People like her are born innocent too. Then the world teaches them lies." Carter frowned. "So she was lied to?" Mariah nodded. "Yes, and those lies made her small." That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Mariah walked out onto her balcony. The city lights shimmered below, 1,000 silent witnesses. She looked up at the sky, dark, endless, and different. She thought about the fight she'd spent her whole career in, breaking barriers, earning respect she'd had to demand instead of receive. She thought of every meeting where she'd been the only black woman in the room, every subtle slight, every raised eyebrow, every patronizing smile disguised as professionalism. She'd built an empire from the ground up, but still, even as a CEO, Even with power, wealth, and influence, her child had been seen as a threat before he was seen as a boy. That realization hollowed her chest. Racism didn't care about titles. It didn't care about wealth. It didn't care who you were, only what color you were born with. Weeks passed. The story eventually began to fade from headlines, replaced by newer scandals, fresher outrage. But for those who lived it, the echoes remained. Langston Air saw record support from communities worldwide. Messages flooded in, from mothers, fathers, teachers, and strangers, thanking Mariah for her courage, her grace, her restraint. But for Mariah, the real victory wasn't in praise. It was in the quiet moments she found one morning, months later, when she walked her sons to school and realized they were smiling again, not the forced smiles of healing, but real, bright, unguarded joy, the kind only children can carry. They waved goodbye and ran inside, their backpacks bouncing, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. Mariah stood there for a moment, eyes closed, letting the sound wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she exhaled. Later that week, she received a letter, handwritten, shaky, sincere. No return address. It was from Evelyn. "I know you have no reason to read this," it began, "but I need you to know that I see it now. I see how blind I've been, not just in that moment, but all my life. I saw your children as an inconvenience, when they were simply being children. I've been forced to face the ugliness in myself, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to undo what I've done. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Mariah read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her desk. She didn't reply. Some apologies are meant to be received, not returned. That evening, she sat with her sons on the couch, watching the sunset through the wide glass windows. The light painted their faces gold, their laughter filling the room again. In that moment, she realized something. They didn't need the world's permission to be happy. They didn't need society's validation to exist freely. They were whole. They always had been. And maybe, she thought, that's the quiet revolution, not in shouting back, but in continuing to live, love, and rise despite it all. Outside, the world moved on. But somewhere deep within that collective memory, one story lingered. A story of 3 young boys who were seen, for one fleeting moment, as less than human, until their mother reminded everyone what humanity really looks like. The storm had passed, but the sky still carried its bruise. Weeks after the incident, after the noise, after the think pieces and hashtags faded, there remained only the quiet. The kind of quiet that forces you to think, to feel, to reckon with the echoes that never quite leave. Mariah Langston sat alone one evening in her living room, the faint hum of the city beyond her window. Her boys were asleep upstairs, their soft breathing steady, their world once again filled with school projects, comic books, and whispered laughter between bunk beds. She was grateful, but she was also changed. In her hands, she held a photo. The triplets at age 4, their hands sticky with ice cream, faces wide with unfiltered joy. It hurt to look at, not because of pain, but because of what innocence had to lose just to survive. For so many black mothers, that loss isn't rare, it's inherited. A generational burden disguised as a lesson. Be polite. Keep your hands visible. Don't talk back. Don't make them afraid of you. It's the script whispered at kitchen tables, passed down like armor. And Mariah thought, how long do we have to keep teaching our children to survive instead of just letting them live? There's a kind of grief that doesn't come from death. It comes from seeing the truth too clearly. The truth that in 2025, a black child can still be seen as a disturbance before he's seen as a child. That the same world that praises diversity in commercials still tolerates discrimination in silence. We talk about progress as if it's a steady climb. But what if it's more like a loop, a circle we keep tracing, each generation making the same promises while walking the same path? Mariah had built her empire believing she could outwork racism, that excellence could buy her safety, that money could insulate her children from ignorance. But the slap proved otherwise. Because prejudice doesn't knock on your door asking for permission. It doesn't care about resumes, degrees, or zip codes. It hides in glances and hesitation, in the subtle twitch of discomfort that says, "You don't belong here." In the weeks that followed, Mariah began receiving letters, not just from supporters, but from strangers, mothers, fathers, teachers, flight attendants. Some wrote about their rage, others about their guilt. One message stood out. "I used to think racism was something bad people did, but after what happened to your son, I realized it's something good people ignore. I've ignored it too many times. I won't anymore." That was the shift, the quiet revolution Mariah hoped for. Not just outrage, but awareness. Not just sympathy, but reflection. And yet, she knew reflection was never enough. Because reflection comforts the privileged. Action changes the world. So she turned her pain into policy. Langston Air launched a scholarship for underrepresented youth in aviation, not as charity, but as opportunity. They partnered with community programs to train black pilots, flight attendants, and engineers. It wasn't about proving worth. It was about reclaiming space. Space that had always been theirs, but often denied. One day, months later, Mariah spoke at a university, invited not as a CEO, but as a mother. The auditorium was full. Students from every background leaned forward as she spoke, her voice calm but electric. "People like to talk about racism as if it's a storm that comes and goes," she began. "But storms end. This doesn't. Because it's not in the sky, it's in us." She paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not here to shame anyone," she continued. "I'm here to remind you that silence is participation. Every time we laugh off a stereotype, overlook a bias, or excuse a prejudice because it's uncomfortable to confront, we feed it. We let it breathe." A student in the front row raised her hand. "But what can we do? I mean, really do?" Mariah smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Start by seeing. See the people you've learned to overlook. Speak when silence would be safer. Teach your children that equality isn't a slogan, it's a responsibility." Later that night, she sat in her car outside her home, headlights off, the city whispering in the distance. She thought about her sons, growing older in a world that still needed reminders to see them as human. She whispered a prayer, not of fear, but of hope. May they never grow numb to the wrong things. May they never shrink to fit inside someone else's comfort. Because in the end, survival isn't the goal. Freedom is. Somewhere out there, Evelyn Warren lived a quieter life. No interviews, no excuses, no defenses. Just a long, slow confrontation with herself. Neighbors said she started volunteering at a youth center, tutoring kids who looked like the ones she once feared. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was guilt. But maybe, just maybe, it was growth. Proof that even the hardest hearts can change when they finally face their reflection. As the months turned into a year, Mariah noticed something subtle but powerful. The story never truly disappeared. It resurfaced in classrooms, in forums, in conversations about bias training and privilege. Not because of the drama, but because of what it forced people to feel. And that, she realized, was the point. Stories aren't just meant to be told. They're meant to unsettle, to awaken, to remind us that behind every headline is a pulse. Reflection. If you've listened this far, it means you've walked with them, through the fear, the humiliation, the reckoning, and the healing. But now the question becomes, what will you do with what you felt? Will you scroll past the next injustice? Will you say, "That's terrible," and then move on with your day? Or will you remember the small, shaking hands of a boy who just wanted to reach for a cookie, and the mother who refused to let that moment define him? Empathy means nothing without endurance. It's easy to care for 5 minutes. It's harder to carry that care into your daily choices. Who you hire, who you listen to, whose comfort you protect, whose pain you dismiss. This story, their story, isn't a tragedy. It's a mirror, and if you look closely enough, you'll see yourself in it somewhere. Maybe as Mariah, standing up even when your voice trembles. Maybe as the bystander on that flight, frozen between what's right and what's easy. Maybe even as Evelyn, learning that the hardest thing to unlearn is the lie you didn't know you were living. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about race. It's a story about humanity, about how fragile, flawed, and interconnected we all are. It's about the courage to confront what's uncomfortable, and the grace to change even when it hurts. And maybe that's what we need now. Not another viral outrage, not another divided comment section, but a quiet, collective decision to be better, to see deeper, to love louder. As the night deepens, Mariah turns off the last light in the house. The city hums below, unaware of her soft smile in the dark. Upstairs, her son's dream, not of fear, but of flight. She whispers, almost to herself, "You belong, always." And as we close the story, maybe that's the reminder we all need. We belong to each other. Our empathy is our inheritance. Our silence is our surrender. So let's not surrender. Let's keep telling the stories that hurt to hear. Let's keep confronting the truths that make us uncomfortable. Let's keep holding mirrors up to the world until it learns to recognize its own reflection. Because change doesn't start in policy or politics. It starts in the heart that refuses to stay numb. Thank you for walking through this story, for listening, for feeling, for reflecting. If it moved something in you, if it made you think, even for a moment, about what kind of world you want to help build, then stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories that make you feel. Ache, remember, see. If you want to hear more, I'd be truly grateful if you subscribed. Not for numbers, but for connection. Because every listener who stays is another heartbeat for truth. Thank you, and take care of each other.